All right, everyone. So in this lecture video, this is going to be a little bit longer one, but in this video, what I'm going to be addressing is muscle energy use and what that means for muscle tone and exercise. So in this, we're talking about kind of like the culminating thing, looking at the function of the muscle and its ability to do what it's supposed to be doing, right? To allow for motion, but then also what can we do as humans to work on building up the muscle strength and ability to actually carry out motions more efficiently. Okay. All right, so just to review a little bit about muscle energy, right? We're talking about a cell inside the human body. So it's going to require a particular type of energy to function. So like with all cells, we're going to be using ATP, adenosine triphosphate, as the main energy molecule for transferring energy between different parts of our muscle cells. So again, we use that same muscle, all right, same thing that you've talked about with respiration and all of that, right? You're using ATP to carry out all the functions inside of the musculature. Okay, so when we're talking about ATP function in the muscle, it can go in it goes into a slightly different pathway. So we've talked about how in glycolysis you take a glucose molecule, break it down to get to some other kind of source. Well, there's other pathways that can happen inside of muscles to allow you some source of ATP energy to get some kind of reaction. Okay, so one of the benefits of muscle tissue, one of the things that has it's unique to it, is that it has this additional molecule known as creatine. Okay, so creatine is functioning as essentially like an ATP storage molecule in a way, in that it allows you for kind of rapid change of ATP from ATP to ADP, adenosine diphosphate, where it's again not as energetic. It doesn't have that additional phosphate that you break, right? It allows you to kind of restock that ATP so that it's ready to go and be utilized again. So creatine phosphate, again, you guys might have heard of creatine supplements. It was kind of a big conversation piece in the 90s when baseball was when everyone was going for the home run record. Essentially what this is the idea that you've got an additional protein that's inside of the muscle fiber that allows it to repeatedly exchange ADP to ATP and quickly allows for this formation of energy-rich molecules that allow the muscles to function more efficiently. So if you up the amount of creatine that you have, it allows for more ATP exchange to occur and your muscles can actually recover a little bit more quickly and they can function longer. Okay, so whether or not that goes in the ethics of doping and all of that stuff, because this is like a natural product that occurs in that, but again, it's just kind of dependent upon your diet and how much you have, and genetics that are associated with it. That's really not a discussion for this video today, but that's something that we have available in our musculature that helps it separate. Okay, so let's just talk about ATP generation as a whole. Okay, so the main type of muscle or metabolism that we utilize in our musculature is we use aerobic metabolism, right? We're using oxygen to produce ATP. Again, we take glucose, break it down, right, in order for us to get the molecule that we need to carry out all the biological functions inside of our cells. So aerobic metabolism, again, that's kind of, you're breathing in oxygen, doing all of that gas exchange. So with any kind of aerobic respiration, right, you're going to start with glycolysis. You're going to break that down to get your initial source of energy, so you get some ATP from that. Then that creates a pyruvic acid that then changes into ATP via the Krebs cycle. So again, all of these different convoluted steps that we're not going to be spending our time with here. But what I want you to remember is that we are using aerobic respiration or metabolism as our main ability to break down these larger molecules. So mostly glucose or glycogen down into glucose and then into this particular set of reactions. But again, this is generally for when you're doing stuff that is very quick. You need kind of that store, not very quick, stuff that takes a longer time, like just your day-to-day kind of slow movement, that kind of stuff. Okay. If you need a lot of energy very quickly, your body will default to a different pathway, which is using anaerobic respiration. So there's different kinds of anaerobic respiration that exist. The kind that we use as a mammalian organism is we use lactic acid fermentation. So with fermentation, this is when you don't have oxygen available for you to get to the ATP that you need. So what ends up happening is that you have a different pathway occurring, which causes which is caused by enzymes inside of your cell, breaking down glucose into smaller pieces to get some ATP, but again, not as many as you need. Okay. So basically, if your aerobic needs can't be met, anaerobic respiration is going to occur. Again, the mitochondria can do about a third, if you're going in some kind of heavy activity and be that efficient. And that's someone who is super efficient. But essentially what happens here is that you have glycolysis happening, but that pyruvic acid isn't broken down. And what that ends up doing is builds it up in the cell membrane and inside the sarcoplasm, inside the muscle cell, and that ends up generating lactic acid. So because lactic acid is an acid, it makes the environment more acidic, right? You have more hydrogen ions available into that area, which makes it harder for your muscles to contract. So remember, for muscle contraction, right, you have a depolarization of the cell membrane. You have a whole bunch of sodium ions moving in one direction, which changes the overall polarity of the membrane. So instead of it being positive, negative, right, it becomes more neutral. Well, if you start adding a bunch of acid ions, so a bunch of this H plus, that's going to be depolarizing the muscle fiber itself, and it can't contract as well. So this is why your muscles, after you say like sprint for a little bit, start to feel really sore, right? Or they feel sore several days after, is because you have this buildup of lactic acid that takes time for your body to break down. It's not a very quick recovery process. It requires a lot of extra oxygen. It requires rest in order for your body to kind of even back out what's going on inside the cells. So this can lead to muscle fatigue. Okay, so with aerobic respiration, with anaerobic respiration, no matter what, you're going to end up with muscle fatigue. Again, we talked about how muscles reach a limit in terms of their ability to contract. So muscle fatigue is just the inability for your muscles to contract. There's a point where your muscle just will not respond to signaling anymore. Again, because it doesn't have a balance of those sodium potassium ions. It may be that the calcium ions aren't moving back fast enough. It may be that you have a depletion in calcium or something like that makes it harder for your muscles to contract. Depletion of potassium, which makes it harder for it to contract. Again, all of these other things that can lead to fatigue, not only just from use, but also just from messed up chemistry. So when your muscles are unable to contract, either because there's not enough energy, they don't have glycogen anymore, due to lactic acid buildup, again, those are all things that lead to muscle fatigue. And fatigue can be treated very quickly, right? If you rest a little bit, your muscle can start working again. It may take a while, it may take days. That's why your muscles are super sore after you do like a massive workout, especially if you haven't done one for a while. So this leads to variations in recovery period. So whenever you're doing any kind of exercise or any type of exercise, there's generally a recovery period associated with that, right? Some amount of time that it should take, allowing for those muscles to return back to their kind of normal state. So think about when you're doing a workout routine, sometimes you'll have like leg day, then arm day, then back day, all right, then core day or something like that. And that's to allow those muscles and those groups a day of recovery. So while you emphasize exercising other parts of your body, you're allowing that part to rest. Okay, so essentially you need some kind of period. Generally 24 hours is enough to allow the muscles to kind of return to normal. Unless you say are starting working out for the first time, you're going to hurt for a longer period of time because those muscles just aren't as used to working. Okay, so it may be 2 to 3 days for a muscle group to get back in shape, okay, and ready to go for another round. Okay, the last thing to think about in terms of energy is this idea of oxygen debt. You guys might have heard of like sleep debt or something like that, where you need to sleep a certain number of hours for your body to get back to normal. That's kind of like a weird thing to be thinking about, that it may or may not be true. But oxygen debt is something that's definitely true, right? Because this is a chemical reaction, there is going to be an amount of oxygen that you need in order to convert lactic acid back to glucose, right? In order to allow your body to, or pyruvic acid, as a way for your body to actually utilize that again in a different cycle, to use that in an aerobic metabolism way. Okay, so that's why when you're exercising after you're done, like part of the rest is taking deep breaths, right? Allowing your body to absorb as much oxygen as possible to allow for that exchange. Okay, all right, so everything we talked about here just in terms of muscle energy is all relevant when it comes to exercise, right? The ability for your body to use this ATP to efficiently allow your muscles to do some kind of exercise or some kind of work, okay? So what I want to talk about is just kind of what happens to your muscle fibers in terms of exercise. Again, just a little bit about muscle tone and what that means for your muscles to just exist and do their normal thing. A little bit about what different kinds of exercise and different kinds of contractions that can lead to variation in actual exercise. Okay, so let's talk about muscle tone and exercise. Okay, so let's just define muscle tone. Okay, so muscle tone is the resting tension inside of a muscular organ. Okay, so in the other video where I talked about muscle tone, like what tone, compression, that kind of stuff is, again, this is just referring to what tone you have naturally inside of your muscle. So when you're seeing like in commercials and things like that, or when you're working out with someone, they're talking about their muscle tone, right? It's just kind of like how much flexion or like how much contraction do they naturally have, right? Generally more toned muscles are going to have a higher degree of tension in them, right? And you're going to see them, like if you're looking at someone with a six pack, they're going to be like ripped. So generally, like the weaker the muscle is, the less tone it's going to have, the less contraction it's going to hold on to in a continued period of time. And one thing to note though with muscle tone is that even if you have muscles that you can't see, like someone who has like excess amount of fat around their abdominal region, for example, it doesn't mean that their muscles are weak. Their muscles are probably pretty strong because they're having to support a large portion of their body up and keep that erect. Okay, it's just that you may or may not be able to see. It doesn't mean that the muscle is not toned. Okay, so tone does not mean like visibility. Okay, and that's oftentimes an association that is made with muscle tone. But again, the weaker the muscle, generally the less tone that it has. One thing about tone, right, and the reason why we have to maintain it is that tone allows for support and muscle protection of the organ. So if you have no tone in your muscles, you're not going to have any level of support. So you're going to be hunching over, things like that, okay? To maintain kind of that just normal posture, your muscles have to contract a little bit. So that is the tone that you need to maintain in order for your body to function normally. Okay. And again, that muscle tone, just because you have it contracting a little bit, makes the muscle a little bit more rigid and a little more sturdy. So that way it can resist actual damage a little bit better, right? It's kind of like a hardened kind of, like if you compress it, right, it just makes it a little bit harder and more difficult to get through. Okay. So what can end up happening to someone if you say are working out or someone is injured, sick, something like that, the muscle tone can actually change. Okay, muscle tone changes pretty fast. Actually, like you can lose a lot of muscle tone in like a week, 2 weeks, a month of not exercising that particular group of muscles. Okay, and so we call the loss of muscle tone atrophy. Okay, so when muscle fibers aren't stimulated and they don't work or contract, or they start to weaken, all right, we say that the muscle is entering this atrophy state. Okay, it's essentially where your muscles are getting weaker and they often shrink in size. They often get smaller. Okay, atrophy is generally associated with someone in poor health, right? In the sense that you can't actually work on that particular muscle and do certain things with that muscle. Okay, so one thing to note though with atrophy is that atrophy is easily reversible, right? If you start doing exercises for that particular muscle, it'll end up reversing atrophy and the muscle fiber will recover and it'll get stimulated and it'll actually start to grow. Okay, but however, there is a point where atrophy can get so far that the muscle tissue actually dies. This is often a concern in individuals who are injured or say have spinal cord injuries where they're no longer able to actually send signals to those muscles, right? Oftentimes with those, you have to do some kind of physical therapy, something like that to make sure that that tissue doesn't go into this atrophy state that leads to death, right? It's not because like it's, like since you're not using the muscle, like it's dead, like what's the matter? Like you're not able to use it anymore. Well, it's that dead tissue can lead to infection that leads to amputation or death. Okay. So generally, like if you say are in the hospital bed for a while after a major injury, you go to physical therapy because the whole point of that is to work on reversing that atrophy that happens. Okay. So atrophy is often a common side effect of, or a common state that happens after any kind of major muscle injury or any kind of other injury, just because you're unable to actually get up and move. Okay. So with atrophy though, right, it leads to kind of a discussion and I'll get to that here in a second, just about how or what that means for atrophy, for muscle size, and for individuals who are going through different kinds of stages in terms of the exercising they're doing, the sport that they're playing, and what that means for just muscle tone as a whole. Okay, so let's just talk about the types of contractions that you can have that can affect muscle tone. There are two major types of muscle contractions that happen. They all deal with like how much you change the length of the muscle. Okay, so one of the types of muscle contraction you have is called an isometric contraction. So this is where the muscle contracts, but the length of the muscle doesn't change. Okay, so essentially an exercise you can do where you can exhibit an isometric exercise is like stand and push at the door. Right? That door is not going to be moving. But what that does is that you're continually sending the signal to that muscle to contract, right? And you're actually putting more compression, right? You're applying more force onto your muscles for a longer period of time doing those isometric exercises to help kind of increase the overall tone, right? It's sending a signal to the muscles to contract more. And doing isometrics, you're not having any range of motion, right? You're just kind of staying put and you're pushing, right? But those exercises can lead to, again, stronger muscles, right? It's still a muscle contraction, it's still an exercise. It's just what its main goal is a little bit different than, say, what you might get with doing an isotonic kind of exercise or kind of changing it. Okay, so again, like I said, like if you take and push on the wall, that's an example of an isometric one. Another common one is to take your palms, right? If you take your two palms and you push at each other, that's an isometric exercise that's forcing you to work your biceps. And if you do that for a long period of time, your muscles will fatigue a lot. And one thing you can do with those isometrics as well is that you can change the length and still continue that. So you can do that by just like pushing like more left or more right, with your, I feel like I'm doing I Dream of Jeannie stuff, is that you are pushing more left or more right with one of your arms, and that can change the effect of that and like what you're actually working in terms of your isometrics. When you're doing isometric exercises, so again, those that don't change the length of the muscle, one thing you have to think about is that since you're not changing the length during that contraction, you need to do it at multiple heights. So like if you're pushing at the wall, push it up like higher, then lower, then straight in front of your chest, and then down and down, just mainly to allow for more range of motion in terms of your contraction. Okay. So one of the questions I get a lot is, why would I change the range if I'm doing that isometrics? Is that when you're doing that, you're only, again, pushing part of your muscle at any given time, okay? Again, not all of it is contracting at once. So to make sure that you're covering all the muscle to make it function normal, to get that contraction and get the full muscle in use, you're gonna have to change position with the isometrics, okay? So if you are doing isometrics, the other type of contraction you have is isotonic. So isotonic contractions are contractions where your tension is generated because the length of the muscle changes. So again, just like your normal muscle contraction. So if you like are doing a bicep curl, if you're doing any kind of lifting, moving, changing position where the muscle changes length, that's going to be an example of an isotonic contraction or exercise. Isotonic contractions have their benefit because you are working the range of the entire muscle. You can limit the range, obviously, by the type of exercise that you do. Like if you're doing a bicep curl, it's different from like where you're starting straight in front of you versus like where you're starting closer up, or where you're starting all the way down with your arms completely extended and then doing the flexion all the way up. Again, by increasing the range of motion, you're applying the force over a longer period of time. You're signaling almost all the muscles during that contraction, okay, in order for them to experience and then work. So there are advantages to doing isotonic contractions. One of the disadvantages of doing these is oftentimes people get injured more so when they're doing exercises that are more isotonic heavy, mainly because that tension that you're generating, if you say put too much weight on, right, you're kind of pressing the limit of what your arms can handle or your legs can handle or whatever part of your body can handle, which can lead to damage and injury. So again, with isotonics, you have that added issue. Isometrics, yes, you can do that, but most of the time you're not doing exercises that are going to require that. Okay. So the last thing that I want to bring up and talk about is just with the idea of the opposite of atrophy. There's a point where your muscles, right, are shrink and start to die, but there's a point where you can work out so much that your muscles can burst and die, essentially. The idea of this is called hypertrophy. So atrophy just means where your muscles are getting weak. Hypertrophy is where your muscles are getting larger. And they can get larger to the point where your muscles can no longer be contained inside their connective tissue and they can actually burst. Or the tension or tone inside of them is so high that it can actually inhibit motion. And make it difficult for those muscles to flex because they're just so used to being contracted that trying to extend them or release that is not going to happen. This can happen if you say are working out a particular muscle group too much and you're not working out the antagonistic pair. I see this a lot with individuals in sports. What they can do sometimes is that they're really into like getting their upper body like super strong, and so they'll just do like a ton of bench presses, a ton of curls, and focus on those things as opposed to doing also like lat pulls and back exercises and doing tricep lifts and things so that they can work out the antagonistic pair, and that can lead to issues with contraction, and you look uneven. So hypertrophy is often associated with other disorders like body dysmorphia and those kinds of things. Like those that individuals will sometimes work out and become hypertrophic because they have body image issues. It's not to say that hypertrophy is, there goes the alarm, is necessarily bad. Like hypertrophy can be effective and it can create large, strong muscles. Kind of people that generally have a good balance of that are bodybuilders. They can work out, become a certain size, right? But generally they reach a limit and they can't get too much bigger. But if you have individuals who are working out to a point where it's going beyond that, that can lead to more and more issues. Okay. All right. So if you've got questions on muscle tone, exercise, and energy, let me know.